think we've started, so I will get started. Hello and welcome to our session on arms control, where I hope you can see the other panelists. I had all four of them, and now I'm only seeing myself, so maybe the production crew can help with that. We are joined today by three other guests, and I think a statement from Ben Wallace. Are we getting that first, or do we already have that?
It's a privilege to speak to NATO's future leaders today. Although you've set me a tough challenge to talk about arms control and the future of strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region in under 4 minutes, so I'll try my best. In 2 days' time, we will mark Remembrance Day in the United Kingdom and reflect on the Allied efforts to secure freedom from fascism in the Second World War 75 years ago. After the devastating conflict, nations founded post-war institutions like NATO to preserve our international order and protect shared values of freedom, democracy, and justice. The alliance was never about offense, but mutual self-defense, its power resting on deterrence, the ability to convince any aggressor that the price of an attack would be outweighed by the consequences. It worked. For more than 70 years, our nations have enjoyed strategic stability and peace, and NATO's nuclear umbrella, all of which the UK's deterrent formed part, played a pivotal part in persuading others not to build their own nuclear weapons. The West won the Cold War. But even as NATO nations hoped to reap a peace dividend, our adversaries plotted a comeback. Today they are ripping up the rulebook, violating nuclear treaties, militarizing international waters, and developing new novel weapon systems. The likes of Russia stealthily operate below the threshold of traditional alliance response. They are conducting cyber attacks from the shadows, handing weapons to proxies and attempting assassinations with chemical weapons. Meanwhile, North Korea's repeated launches of ballistic missiles and Iran's ongoing destabilizing activity throughout the region raise deep concerns. The old world of static peace and war has been replaced by a new age of constant conflict. NATO still guards our borders and reaches deep across continents, but it must adapt to remain as potent in 2030. So we're asking ourselves some searching questions. How can the alliance provide a credible deterrent in an age of non-traditional warfare? What can it do to prevent an arms free-for-all? And how can future arms control agreements support our security? I don't have all the answers, but security is not a competition, it is a partnership. And history shows us that as long as we work in solidarity, we will maintain the strategic stability on which our peace and prosperity depend.
Well, thank you for that nice message from the British Defense Secretary, and welcome everyone to our panel. I think we're all on now. I can see everybody. We're all good. This is our panel on arms control and strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region going forward. We have three wonderful guests here today. We had, let me get this correct. We have Jessica Cox, Director of Nuclear Policy at NATO. Pia Fuhrhop, Head of the Berlin Office of the Institute for Peace and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And Heather Williams, lecturer at King's College London. And I'm Kevin Barron. I'm your moderator. I'm the executive editor of Defense One. We are a national security, military, and defense-focused news organization here in Washington. I'm a Pentagon reporter by trade. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. And as an editor, I'm frequently moderating at events like these with NATO. And very happy to be back and be able to support this interesting and important event. Happy to pay it forward. We were all young professionals once. I guess I'm not one because I get to moderate now. So I used to be young. Now I'm just a professional. So you have something to aspire to. So let's get right to it. We're not going to do opening statements. We want to get questions through the audience as soon as we can. But just to help lay the land of where arms control is, you can read a lot about this at Defense One and lots of other places. And maybe some of you know a lot of what's going on. I know on the tip of a lot of people's tongues is what's on the calendar. New START expiring soon. And a new president in the United States, a president-elect, unless you're one of the few holdouts in America hoping for a different outcome when the votes are really all the way counted. It looks like President-elect Joe Biden will be here, which is important for arms control because it has to do with whether or not New START survives in any form going forward. There are other issues as well on the table, but Jessica Cox, please start us off with kind of telling everyone what's the most important issues on the agenda at NATO right now that is occupying your time, and where we should all be looking in the especially the near future and the next coming months of what to expect.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to Munich Security Conference and NATO for having me. And I want to just start off by saying, I think we're all very excited about the Biden administration and what they are going to do on New START. Biden has been very clear as a candidate that he supports New START extension, which is, of course, the position of most, if not all, of the allies here at NATO. So we are hopeful that the talks between the current administration and Russia can continue during the transition period, and that the treaty can be extended in February or before February when it's set to expire. That said, New START isn't kind of the panacea for all of our problems at NATO. Russia has been undergoing a strategic and non-strategic military buildup, particularly with its nuclear arsenal over the past decade. And that is most kind of notably and recently seen with its intermediate range cruise missiles that it developed and deployed in violation of the INF Treaty, which caused the end of that treaty in late or mid last year. But we're also seeing Russia develop and deploy capabilities such as hypersonic missile systems, such as a wide array of air, sea, and ground-launched missile systems. So the threat picture doesn't stop with New START and maintaining the strategic balance. We also have to look at the balance below the strategic level. So let me stop there and look forward to the rest of the questions.
Let me then perhaps, well, we'll just begin as good on the line, and I can ask Heather if you want to pick up on what you heard or add a different element to the topic, to the conversations to start. Heather, can you hear us? I know she's on a little delay.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming in great.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So I really want to, I think, foot stomp what Jessica said, which is that New START is not the end all be all here. Obviously it should be the priority because it is a rapidly approaching deadline that we need to be aware of. But this conference is about NATO in 2030. So I just quickly want to kind of point to some issues that we can start thinking about with arms control over the next decade. And if we do think about this, arms control doesn't happen in a vacuum. Right? It has to be tied to geopolitics. So the arms control that we evolve over the next decade really depends on what happens with geopolitics over the next decade, particularly identifying areas of common interest. And I do think there is a common interest within the Euro-Atlantic region to strengthen strategic stability. And just really quickly, we can think of strategic stability as arms race stability and crisis stability. And based on the polling that I saw earlier on this conference, there seems to be a lot of consensus among NATO youth about the potential impact of cyber and other emerging technologies. So we have to start thinking about how those technologies are going to impact on crises and arms racing. But I do always try to be an arms control optimist. And so to get the conversation going, I wanted to highlight 3 areas where I think we might be able to be optimistic about arms control and questions for people to start considering. First, a lot of these emerging technologies, they're really costly. They're going to be expensive. To pick up on Ian Bremmer's question, what will the global economy look like in 2030? And will investment priorities shift from defense to other issues? Second, we're seeing new leadership in arms control, particularly in Europe. The German Foreign Ministry hosted a great conference last week on this topic. So what role can Europeans play in arms control? And then lastly, with the election of President-elect Biden, I get the sense of increasing optimism about arms control, which is great. But what do Europeans and America's European allies want to see for the future of arms control as well? Is it multilateral? Is it a continuation of U.S.-Russia bilateral? Is it all of the above and something else? And so I'll leave it there. But thank you to the organizers. Again, this is a great opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We'll get to all those points. Pia, up to you as well. You had said earlier you in your message that you wanted to get to finer points, maybe for especially this audience. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and also thank you to the organizers for having me. I will try and also pick up on what Heather said, and I think it's correct that arms control and geopolitics interrelate. But I think it's really important for this session to keep in mind that arms control is not a dependent variable. It can independently affect geopolitics. And I think sort of if I were to say, what do I wish for the alliance to do in the next 10 years or to be in the next 10 years, then I think it's to be a bit more enthusiastic and more active and more concrete on arms control. And I think for all the reasons Heather has described and Jessica has described, there has been a lot of emphasis on deterrence. But I think in thinking about NATO's future, the US as well as European allies really have to sort of be a bit more proactive on what it is that they want to achieve in arms control.
Good points, all as well. I'm reading some of the questions that have come in from the viewers, from the participants in the Youth Summit, and I remind everyone to please send those in. I think I forgot to mention the instructions ahead of time, but I think the viewers know by now how to do that. Again, if you're a general public viewer, you don't have the ability to ask questions, but if you're a registered member of the summit, you can. And I'll get to that real quickly. I want to just ask all of you, like I said in the beginning, New START is the big story as a journalist that we're all looking toward right now. But last year it was INF. And one of the worries of INF was when it expired, so did any protections that were there to prevent Russia from having or obtaining or changing the arsenals, that the kinds of missiles specifically that threaten Europe. That's a different threat than the United States. So here in the United States, doesn't get as much attention, not as much worry or concern as ICBMs, as the old Cold War era agreements. But when I spoke to Jens Stoltenberg last year, he made it kind of clear that he remembers growing up under the nuclear umbrella, then under the protection of the INF Treaty. It's real there. So have we seen any changes or anything to worry about since the INF Treaty ended? With those types of missiles, you mentioned hypersonics, and there are possible cruise missiles, other types of tactical nuclear weapons, and the difference between that threat that was created by the expiration of, or the two parties pulling out of that treaty, versus what we're worried about with New START. Maybe Jessica could answer some of that to start. Yeah.
Sure, I can certainly jump in. I think in general, NATO allies were very disappointed at the end of the INF Treaty because, as you say, it has been a key pillar of Euro-Atlantic security for 20, 30 years now. But the truth of the matter is Russia was developing and deploying a range of intermediate range missiles that were not covered treaty, in addition to violating the treaty and covering by producing and deploying missiles that were in violation. So it wasn't really benefiting NATO anymore. And when we tried to engage Russia, both from a US standpoint, and I had the opportunity to participate as a US government official before joining NATO on our discussions with the Russians on INF, but also once I came to NATO and we tried to engage Russia directly, it was very clear that Russia had no intention of coming back into compliance with the treaty. So I think, it's unfortunate because it has left Europe a little bit vulnerable to these systems. And so, as Pia mentioned before, we have been looking at how we mitigate the risks that are now posed by Russia's missile systems. And NATO's really spent the last 2 years looking at ways that we can not only strengthen the resiliency and survivability of our nuclear systems in response to Russia's violation and its missile developments, but also look at ways we can enhance our defensive capabilities, ways that we can potentially invest more in conventional capabilities as well to make sure that Russia doesn't gain an advantage in the Euro-Atlantic region. So that is a lot of what NATO has been looking at. We've also been looking at arms control and what new arms control mechanisms we could potentially develop that would strengthen both existing regimes that cover missiles like the MTCR, but also trying to develop new ideas to enhance the stability of the region. The problem that we face is that NATO as an organization is not party to any arms control, and we wouldn't negotiate. So it's really based on what our member countries with the capabilities and the technologies will negotiate in coordination with the whole alliance. And that's an ongoing work in progress right now.
Yeah, let me put it to our other two panelists, but also I'll add it to the question that's come in from the viewers because it's on the same thread. What I'm thinking when I hear your answer is the answer for this kind of arms control more agreements, or is it deterrent capabilities that the members need to build up? And the top question that everyone's getting the most thumbs up on is from Elise Carreau from France, who says, does NATO's deterrence strategy depend too heavily on the military power of the United States? What would the future of NATO look like without a strong U.S. support? Let's focus on the first part of that question. NATO deterrence strategy, does it depend too heavily on the military power of the United States? Again, how much is this? Do we need a military response as an answer versus what arms control can do? Pia or Heather?
Maybe I'll take the arms control part, if I may, Heather. I think you're way better suited to speak to the what do we do if the United States leaves us part. And I really think sort of it's important to remember when we talk about INF that there is a proposal by the Russians on a moratorium for non-deployment, and I think so far the alliance has answered in saying this is not a reliable proposal. It's one that sort of, gives Russia the benefit for cheating in the INF. And I think sort of that perfectly captures, this answer perfectly sort of captures the dilemma. I think it's fair to be mistrusting Russia, but I think it's also important for the alliance to take up these proposals and really put to a test the seriousness of Russia's attempts to restart arms control. So I think really for the alliance, it always has been a balancing act between deterrence and arms control. And I think it's very clear, or to me at least, it's becoming clearer what the deterrence side is, and it's a lot less clear what the arms control side is. Would the alliance be willing to think about proposals like central storage for certain missiles and launchers and make sure that we at least get into a conversation, even if we don't solve it at this point?
Yes, Heather?
Thanks, and sorry again about the delay. Just two points to really reinforce what Pia said. Deterrence and arms control, they're not mutually exclusive, right? In a lot of ways, they're self-reinforcing. They work in tandem together. And that that goes back in NATO's history to the Harmel Report, and it's really at the core of the alliance. And so I think it can be dangerous if we start thinking of these ideas as in competition or mutually exclusive, but really thinking about how they work together, which I think both Jessica and Pia captured. And then to this question about, what to do if the U.S. draws down its military power, its military presence. For the incoming Biden administration, Biden has said repeatedly that he is deeply committed to NATO and to the allies. I think a direct quote was something along the lines of NATO is the most important military alliance in history. So I can understand with the previous administration where these concerns come from. With the incoming one, I think that we can be pretty confident that the new president is going to be deeply committed to this alliance and to the allies. But I can understand the longer term concern here. What if there's another change of administration? And so I think that requires a lot more long-term planning on NATO's part and consideration by the allies. As Jessica said, this is up to the members, really. And so if the membership as a whole decides that in that balance, in how they look at arms control and military commitments, that's really something for the allies as a whole to decide. If there is a deep concern about U.S. commitment, then I would think that would prompt more of a discussion about burden sharing. I know everyone's sick of talking about burden sharing, but it does predate President Trump. And it's interesting to hear that that was the most popular question among in the chat. I can't see it, but if that was, then that makes me ask, well, then do the other members want to start investing and committing more, or are there some other ways to hedge or rebalance against concerns about U.S. long-term commitment?
Yeah. First off, Heather, let us get through this one election before we get to the next one, please. I'm exhausted. We'll focus on this administration. Well, yeah, that was the lead question. And to be fair, the question it didn't say anything about should the U.S. pull out or withdraw resources. It was just saying, are there ways that are not as reliant as the U.S. military, which of course has been a theme for the last 4 years, and lots of us who watch NATO don't think that's going to change, just because of the U.S. presidency has changed. The other questions below it are all, or a few of them, I'll combine into one from, let's see, Leonard Freud, Cameron Vasca, pardon if that's the pronunciation of your name, Luca Ignac, all of these are about what role NATO can have in facilitating arms control agreements. Can they have more of a role? Should they assume more of a role? Jessica, you kind of mentioned that earlier, that NATO doesn't do the direct negotiations for countries. So what role does NATO play in that dichotomy?
So I certainly can speak to the role that NATO has played in the past, and I think what we're trying to do is figure out what the role will be in the future. And I should note that I am not the lead on the arms control issues for NATO. There's another director who's committed full-time to doing arms control. But a lot of what NATO has done in the past is be a forum for coordination amongst the allies, for developing proposals that are complementary to NATO's deterrence strategy, as Heather mentioned, the Harmel report, and NATO's dual track decision that predated presage of the INF treaty. But I think even more important than all of that is just the role that NATO plays in bringing ideas to the fore, allowing allies to have a place to work out issues amongst the allies first, before proposals are floated with other countries or potential adversaries in this case, and make sure that whatever is done and developed is in the security interest of all allies. And that's really important because our alliance, while grounded and rooted in a common geography, has very different security interests across the alliance. I mean, our German allies have a very different view of the world than our Romanian allies and our Spanish allies. And we have to remember that different allies have different priorities and different security needs, which is why NATO can play this really important role of making sure that all allies are heard and all allies are supportive of our initiatives and ideas that are being put on the table. So I think that consultative nature of NATO is really important. And then the second role, which I think is one that really came to the fore through the INF discussions with Russia, was the role that NATO plays in sending a unified message. Allies were very unified in the messages that it sent to Russia throughout the INF process. Support for the United States, acknowledgement that Russia's developing missile system was in violation of the treaty and that it would not be accepted. And so I think that is another role that NATO plays, is putting up a united front, saying this is the right thing to do, and using the alliance as a whole to create negotiating pressure and bringing our negotiating partners to the table.
Good, thank you. And so we're in our last 5 minutes now, just starting. Boy, this goes quick. And we have questions about cyber, about China, and I want to make sure we get a word in about the nuclear ban treaty that was also on our list. So let's do China first, and if we all maybe shorten some answers, or if you have something else you want to say, feel free to chime in. We'll use our time aggressively, call it a lightning round. Britta Jacob from Germany, her question is, how could China be integrated in a serious and credible disarmament initiative? And what would NATO states have to offer in order to achieve this goal? Who wants to tackle that?
I can try.
Everyone all at once. Come on, Pia.
I'll try. So I think there are three things to keep in mind. First, I think bringing China in will be important because it's so important to the United States. Still, bringing China in is no excuse for the necessary developments that have to take place between the US and Russia. And I think one of the things that European allies need to make sure is drive home that message, that the two countries with sort of the biggest nuclear arsenal are the ones who need to take necessary steps. And I think the last thing that always comes to my mind when we talk about China is that to bring China in will require us to be a bit more creative in arms control. These are very asymmetric capabilities, and it will not be the usual counting we're used to. And so maybe even just for that reason, we should try to do it, because there's a need for more creativity when it comes to thinking about future arrangements.
That goes, Heather, I thought you may have nodded into that, but the next question may help with any other answers, and that's, what are the prospects for arms control around technologies like cyber, especially when NATO allies have different varying positions on the offensive uses of cyber? That question's from Danielle Murad Weiss, if I got that right, from Canada. So cyber's in the mix too, but what are your reactions there?
Sure. Just a really quick comment on China first, and then I'll say something on cyber and other technologies. So just on China, I think that we need to think about China arms control as a long-term project, right? We have to think about how to socialize China into arms control practices and principles. This is particularly important around verification. The US and Russia have decades of experience working on these issues together. It's not just the technical factors, it's also just the practice of being more transparent. So I really do think that we have to take a longer term vision about bringing China in. On emerging technologies, just really briefly, I'm guilty of this as much as everybody, but we have to be more specific when we talk about emerging technologies, but particularly about their applications. If we want to talk about all cyber arms control, that's simply too big of a project. We really have to start thinking and isolating down into what are the biggest risks, particularly as it relates to nuclear weapons. And just to, for a second, really plug great work being done by Marina Favreau at BASIC and also at King's College London. Her work is trying to isolate this, but I know others are doing the same. If we can think more specifically, for example, what are cyber threats to nuclear command and control? Well, how could AI be incorporated and increase crisis and stability? We have to get really specific into those applications and then tailor arms control accordingly, I think.
Jessica, on cyber, we've covered at Defense One the evolution of NATO into the world of cyber and cybersecurity. How does that equate to or relate to, when we think of traditional arms control or nuclear weapons? I mean, it's all related.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would just echo what Heather said, which is we have to look at specifics and not just categories. And I think from a nuclear standpoint, what we think about in terms of cyber is both the opportunities and the challenges that it poses. So, for instance, obviously from a nuclear perspective, we are very worried about cyber intrusions into our nuclear command and control infrastructure. This is something that both the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review discussed, and also the new Russian nuclear doctrine alluded to this as well. So we have to think about the potential implications of non-kinetic attacks on our command and control in particular, but our nuclear infrastructure more broadly. And at NATO, we look at this very closely, and we're taking a lot of steps to modernize these types of systems and look at potential vulnerabilities. But I think we also have opportunities as well to think about how we can better use cyber in arms control and in arms control regimes in particular. when you think of the type of verification and monitoring and inspections that we would need for any kind of arms control agreement with China, say, if you have procedures that are less intrusive, China might be more willing to do them. And the way you would do that is using cyber tools, using overhead imagery, commercially available imagery, using some of these emerging technologies in ways that allows for the same types of verification and gives us similar confidence in our systems, but uses new technologies in new and creative ways. And I know many people are thinking about this, but I think that this is where the arms control community needs to move, is getting out of kind of the boots on the ground approach and thinking more about the tools that we have that can take us into the future.